things, and Jesus didn't want to go there. He wanted to keep a bit of a low profile, and I suppose we can understand that at this point in time. But then he begins to teach them in verse 31 that the Son of Man must suffer many things. Now, for all the different ideas about the Messiah in the first century, some saw him as a primarily priestly figure. Others saw him more like a king. Some others saw it as a combination of those various roles. None of the messianic expectations contain anything about a Messiah who would suffer. And so right here, Jesus kind of veers off the track, shall we say, of natural expectation. He says the Son of Man must suffer. Did you notice that? It's must, it's not might. He doesn't say, listen, boys, I am the Messiah, and there's a slim possibility that this might go pear-shaped on me. I'm taking a bit of a risk here. I just want you to know there's a possibility this could get ugly. He says, no, I must. I must suffer many things. I must be rejected by the religious leaders, which isn't that surprising. They haven't got on too well so far in the gospel. He says, I must die, I must be killed, and after 3 days, rise again. And did you notice the reference where it says in verse 32 that he spoke plainly about this? Chapter 4, verse 34, we're told by Mark that Jesus never said anything that wasn't in parables. He always used indirect speech. And all of a sudden, he changed tacks and says, I'm going to tell you this plainly, straight up. No indirect speech, no funky stories, no Samaritans helping out, no runaway sons, no strange things, just here it is. This is what happens. And Peter rebukes him. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. Now, first of all, it's a very strong word. It's the same sort of word that's used in exorcisms. So this isn't kind of a quiet chat over a cup of coffee for clarification. This is a serious rebuke. But consider all the things that Jesus has said. Imagine if your mate started going around saying, I forgive your sins. I forgive your sins. Yep, you're forgiven as well. Same in the back. Yep. Wouldn't you want to take them aside and say, dude, you'd want to be careful about where you say those sorts of things. The religious leaders get really cranky when people start blaspheming God. Wouldn't that be a good time to rebuke somebody? Or when Jesus starts saying, you know what, all foods are clean. I know that Moses wrote that stuff down. I know you've been following it for thousands of years, but really, all food is clean. Wouldn't you want to take him aside and say, Jesus, that's like our whole life. That's kind of what defines us as Jewish people. That's what are you doing? When Jesus says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, so we'll do whatever I want to do on the Sabbath. Wouldn't you want to take him aside and say, Lord, what is that all about? None of those instances have raised the ire of the disciples until Jesus says, yes, I am the Christ, and I must suffer. And Peter takes him aside and says, what are you doing? Isn't that interesting? That only here, nowhere else do the disciples take Jesus aside and say, I think you've lost it. The religious leaders think he's demon-possessed. His family thinks he's insane. His disciples just go along with it until this. There's something in here, don't you reckon? Now, we're not told what the rebuke is, but we actually have, I think, a couple of clues. Because in Mark's account, 3 times Jesus predicts his death. 3 times. Here in chapter 8, again in chapter 9, verse 30 and 32, and again in Mark 10, verses 32 to 34. And in each of those instances, it's followed up by the disciples' misunderstanding. Here, Peter rebukes Jesus, and we'll get to what Jesus has to say to him in a moment. In chapter 9, immediately after he talks about his suffering again, we have the disciples arguing on the road about who is the greatest. And in chapter 10, after Jesus predicts his death, a 3rd time, Peter and John come and say, James and John come and say, can we have positions on your right and on your left when you come into your glory? Now, do you pick the theme that's in there? The disciples in chapter 9 and chapter 10 associate the greatness of the Messiah with earthly human greatness, don't they? So James and John understand who Jesus is. You're the Messiah, and that means glory. So when you come to your glory, how about it? They're arguing on the road. Why are they arguing about who is the greatest? Because the kingdom is about to come in. We're following the Messiah. It's all going to happen, and guess what? We're in the driver's seat. So who gets shotgun? I would have loved to have heard that conversation. Whatever Peter is getting on here, whatever he's rebuking Jesus about, it seems to be closely linked to this idea of status and honor and all the things that go with greatness. Do you hear what Jesus says to him? I mean, in chapter 8, verse 20 and 21, Jesus rebukes their faith and never is as strong as he is here. When the disciples completely miss the point, which they do in that passage, it's the passage where Jesus says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, or the feast of Herod, I think it is, the yeast of Herod, and they go, oh, he's saying that because we didn't bring any bread. And Jesus goes, what are you talking about bread for? But he doesn't rebuke them. Here, what does he say? Get behind me, Satan. Satan? Really? And he rebukes Peter and says, you have in mind the things of humanity, not the things of God. Here, at this point in time in the gospel, nowhere else has he rebuked them. He hasn't said to them, you have no faith. You have no understanding. You have no insight. Nowhere has he linked that with some sort of satanic agenda. Here, when Peter takes him aside and says, you've got it wrong about what it means to be the Christ, Jesus says to Peter, no, you have got it wrong. And not just a little wrong, seriously wrong. It's not just that God has one thing in mind and you've got something else in mind. You're actually, in essence, siding with the anti-God movement. And so Jesus calls everyone together. And what does he say? Whoever wants to be my disciple. He talks now about following him. And notice that this is the first reference to the cross. He didn't say how he was going to die. He just says, I will be killed. The very first reference to the cross in the gospel is actually in the context of discipleship. And what does he say? He says, following me is defined by self-denial. It's defined by suffering. It's defined by loss. It's defined by missing out on worldly gain and worldly wealth and worldly honor. It's curious, isn't it? When we think about the cross, when we think about what Jesus has done for us, we often emphasize and focus on the pain. Have you ever heard that sermon? Right? Talks about the physiological pain of crucifixion and how it pulls your lungs the wrong way and the shredding muscles on the back and the blood loss and the nails were that long and all that kind of stuff, right? You've heard that all? Read through the Gospels. Do you want to know how many references there are to the pain of crucifixion? None. Not one. Not once. Nowhere do the Gospels say, and in terrible pain and tremendous physical suffering, Jesus cried out. You know what the Gospels actually focus on? The humiliation, the mockery, the mocking sign that says this is the King of the Jews. The mockery of the crowds who walk by and say, ha, you who are going to destroy the temple in 3 days and then build it again, come on down and we'll believe you. The mockery of the chief priests who say, ha, he could save others, he can't save himself. Come down from the cross. The mockery of the thieves on the other side. The pain, I suppose, was taken for granted. No one needed to be told that crucifixion was painful. But the emphasis is actually on humiliation. And do you notice the language that Jesus then picks up in verse 38 here? The tricky passage here. If any of you are ashamed of me and my words, and what's the context? Ashamed of me, the suffering Messiah, and my words about suffering. If you are ashamed of me there, the Son of Man will be ashamed of you when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. Now, that last reference to the holy angels and the Father's glory, we tend to think of that as kind of a second coming allusion, don't we? It sounds really second coming-like, and we'll talk a bit more about that next week, actually. But I think in reality that the language, the reference here, which is taken from Daniel chapter 7, 13 and 14, is actually to the receiving of dominion and honor and majesty and kingdom of the Son of Man who comes before the Ancient of Days. which suggests that when Jesus comes in his Father's glory, when he receives dominion, when he receives majesty, when he receives kingdom, it's actually somewhere in the period of time when he is crucified and when he is resurrected. That is when Jesus comes into his glory. It's the language of John's gospel, isn't it? Now has come the time for me to be glorified. If you are ashamed of me, he says, when I am hanging on a cross, mocked, ridiculed, reviled, spat upon, looked down upon, regarded as nothing and cursed by God, if you are ashamed of me then, you have missed it. Jesus has made the tension worse, hasn't he? Spectacular glory. Coming in the glory of my Father with the angels, receiving all dominion and authority and rule forever and ever. Every knee shall bow, every tongue confess, and I will suffer. And if you are going to follow after me, you must do the same. And honor is something we hold on to quite tightly, don't we? Do you want to know the real danger of wealth in our world? It's not that people are going to start building little shrines to it in their homes and kind of having little piles of bills kind of neatly lined up and candles and kind of bow down to it. That's not the danger of wealth. You know the danger of wealth? Is that wealth brings us status.